begin the program with some somber thoughts today. You know, we are, of course, in the midst of great tumult in American society today. It's difficult. It's challenging. The divisions are visceral. The lines, let's show a little bit of the rioting and the peaceful protests both that we have seen happen throughout the course of the past several days. We're now, I think, past a week of rioting that began in Minneapolis following legitimate and peaceful protests. And we have seen mostly peaceful and legitimate protests as far as what has been happening across the country. You are seeing some of the rioting right now that we have seen. Let's show some of the peaceful protesting as well, because this is what we need to keep in mind is happening across the country and the world, that there are people who are peacefully protesting injustice and who want genuine change in the world. Now, we need to have a discussion about what that change means and what that change actually entails. But nevertheless, it's happening in terms of the protests. The civil unrest is in no way an exemplification of anything positive about America, nor is the civil unrest, the violent, yes, I use the word violent, activities going on across the country as far as property destruction and looting and burning. There's no excuse whatsoever for any of that. And as we've talked about on this program a number of times already, it must stop. And it particularly must stop, and I want to start with this side of everything that we have been seeing, because not only are we losing property, it's being stolen or destroyed, burned to the ground, government buildings included, meaning taxpayer dollars have to spend money on that, meaning businesses will have to forestall investments, hiring new workers, giving wage increases, forestall reopening as they're just finally able to start reopening. We talked about all of this yesterday. But we've also been seeing a number of deaths across the country. People who have died primarily because, not exclusively because, but primarily because of the rioters. Wikipedia and some other sources have been keeping tabs on those who have died from the civil unrest, the rioting that we've been seeing. Calvin Horton Jr. died on May 27th, shot during a protest. We got a 21-year-old young man in Detroit, a young black man watching, as I recall, in his car, was killed. On May 30th, Oakland, Federal Protective Services officer David Patrick Underwood was killed, shot outside a federal courthouse. Black man. On May 30th, St. Louis, man died after being dragged behind the wheels of a FedEx truck trailer that, according to police, was fleeing from a group of protesters. We have seen these types of situations where vehicles have been surrounded and they're trying to get out of there and they're scared. May 30th, Omaha, 22-year-old protester James Scurlock fatally shot outside of a bar by the owner of the bar. He was the owner of the bar, and there had been a scuffle with protesters and things got out of hand. The shooter was the owner of the bar. And when the chaos erupted, he was trying to protect his property. He's not going to be charged because it was in self-defense. May 30th in Indianapolis, 2 people fatally shot in the vicinity of the protests. June 1, Louisville, Kentucky. Restaurateur David McCarty killed when the Louisville Metro Police and the Kentucky National Guard opened fire on a crowd of protesters. We will get to the police in a moment. Davenport, Iowa. 2 people who had been peacefully protesting, as I understand it, were killed, including 22-year-old Italia Marie Kelly, whose sister made a terribly distraught video condemning the violence and what was happening, noting that her sister, the 22-year-old young black woman, had been protesting peacefully and then was killed by violent protesters, a.k.a. rioters, not genuine protesters. Cicero, Illinois. 2 people fatally shot in an afternoon of unrest, confirmed by Cicero police. Shots fired by outside agitators. And we know that agitators are a lot of the instigators of what we're seeing with the violence and unrest. St. Louis, June 2nd, 77-year-old retired police captain David Dorn, another black man, was shot and killed by looters at a pawn shop. Reportedly, it was streamed live on Facebook Live. And then you had attackers and looters who had been killed as well, a handful of them. This is not just about looting. This is not just about property damage. This is not just about buildings being burned down that can be replaced, like lives can be replaced. Lives are being lost here. Most of the lives that have been lost in these violent uprisings, the civil unrest, have been innocents who either were peaceful protesters, trying to protect their property, business owners, and usually they were killed by rioters, agitators. That's the loss of life, and black lives that matter among them. Anybody who is making excuses for this kind of behavior is fundamentally, I don't even have any words. Like Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times. Let's play that. Cut 1 on CBS. What she had to say in providing some sort of an excuse for these rioters.
One, we need to be really careful with our language. Yes, it is disturbing to see property being destroyed. It is disturbing to see people taking property from stores. But these are things. And violence is when an agent of the state kneels on a man's neck until all of the life is leached out of his body. Destroying property which can be replaced is not violence. And to put those things, to use the exact same language to describe those two things, I think really it's not moral to do that. So yes,
it's not moral to say that destroying property is violence when it is, but also she is ignoring the lives that have been lost, including black lives that matter. Young men and women because of these riots. On the other hand, there are two sides to what's happening in terms of legitimate complaints, legitimate gripes, legitimate assertions of inappropriate behavior. This all began because George Floyd was murdered by police officers. Finally, George Floyd, his killers, have been charged, all 4 of them. Aiding and abetting second-degree murder for 3 of the officers, and second-degree murder for Derek Chauvin, the primary officer who killed George Floyd. Those were police officers using excessive force in a senseless act of violence. we have to be honest, too, about the way in which some of the police in this country have been handling these protests, including peaceful situations. For example, 2 young people, Messiah Young, Tanaya Pilgrim, were both in a car together in Atlanta, Georgia. They weren't doing anything wrong or illegal. And yet, the police went to the car, tased them both, and in particular, Messiah had harm done to him. Take a listen to these 2 young people, both college students, together on CNN, I believe, yesterday, telling their story.
I have multiple injuries all over my body. My wrist is cracked. I have 20 stitches in my forearm. I have bruises all over my ribs. And I had a taser in my back for about 8 hours.
What do you mean you had a taser in your back for 8 hours? You mean that what they shot, it stayed in there?
Yes. Initially, some of them were removed, but I informed them that I still had a taser in my back, and it was not taken out of me until around 2 or 3 a.m. And I got tased at around 9:30.
Oh my God. And do you remember being tased? When we look at that video, it looks as though you almost sort of lose control of your limbs. It looks as though you're kind of convulsing. What was it like in that moment?
It's probably one of the hardest moments that I've had to face in my life. I can't even fathom what happened. At this point, I'm just so far gone. It's like I'm trying to remove myself from that situation, but it's really hard to cope with.
And I watched the video, and it is terrible what happened to those 2 young people in a car doing nothing wrong. Asheville, North Carolina. By the way, those officers have been penalized. Some have been, I think, removed from the force. Investigations underway. The Atlanta police have taken quick action, which is good because you need to take swift action for those police officers who are the bad apples, who are doing things they shouldn't do. Asheville, North Carolina. Local police officers destroyed a medical aid station in an outrageous instance of excessive force and inappropriate, unspeakable behavior on the part of some officers. Again, in these instances, they seem to be facing consequences, but there's a problem here that must be addressed, and I think this is what people are protesting, and that is in terms of how police are approaching these issues. How police are handling the peaceful side of these protests, not just the rioting and the looting and the burning. I know that they are putting their lives on the line, and I tremendously appreciate it. I'm a strong believer in the fact that the vast, vast majority of police officers are doing good work. Some have been walking with the marchers. I mean, there are some tremendous stories across this country. But at the same time, we are seeing excessive force, the kind of excessive force that is being protested across the country by police officers. There are 2 sides to the chaos. Most of it, rioters, agitators, who are spurring on some of the aggressive behavior perhaps by police. It doesn't excuse it. We need to get this thing under control. It is terrifying what we're seeing as far as the level of violence and discord. And we need to have our governments across the country take firm action to get this thing addressed. But that does not mean that anything of the excessive force is appropriate. It is not. It must be condemned, must be sussed out, must be penalized. And I'm glad to see most of these police forces seem to be taking action, certainly quicker than what happened to George Floyd and to his killers, in terms of how long it took for them to be charged and fired and these kinds of things. So let's keep in mind there are multiple aspects to this, and we need the full picture. And I wanted to offer that today. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.